Hey there, Alex Kidman here, and this is my video review of the Apple iPhone 16 Pro Max. Let's get into the review. So I've been reviewing iPhones for a long time now, all the way back to the iPhone 3G, in fact. We never actually got the original 2G model iPhone here in Australia. And every year, I'm struck by the fact that some years are really big changes in the way they do iPhone stuff that make them a can't-miss kind of prospect, while other years are much more iterative. They're faster, they're a little bit better. Now, this year, the iPhone 16 Pro Max, I think solidly sits, despite some interesting ideas in there, in that iterative space. It is a faster iPhone. It is a better iPhone. There's a very solid argument to be made. It's the best iPhone that Apple's ever made. However, it's also very, very expensive. There are a few things that either I can't test or that are a little bit more gimmicky. Let's get into that. First of all, having a look at the design. The 16 Pro Max is Apple's biggest phone to date. I mean, it measures in at 163 by 77.6 by 8.25 millimeters, weighs 227 grams. There's a lot in the hand here. There's a lot to hold, and some people will love a bigger phone. I like the fact that the 16 Pro, the smaller cousin of this phone, is otherwise the same phone. That wasn't the case in last year's phone, for example, where there were camera differences, and if you wanted the best that Apple had, you had to buy the Pro Max. That's no longer the case, but there will be some people for whom the Pro Max is the right size. But that size is not insignificant, and you know me, I'm going to advocate for a case, and in fact, Apple loaned me a MagSafe case to go with this, and throughout my review period, it has lived inside this case because I do believe cases are a really sensible investment, but I can't deny the fact that putting a case on this makes this big phone even bigger in the hand. That may be an issue for some. In terms of the display, you're talking a 6.9-inch 2868 by 1320 pixel 120Hz OLED, or ProMotion in Apple speak. It does kind of irk me that ProMotion is kept purely for the Pro phones. Yes, I get it's ProMotion, but seriously, Apple, 120Hz screens are not hard to come by, and you can get that kind of screen refresh rate on a significantly less expensive phone. But it's clearly a differentiation that Apple makes to make the Pro phones feel a bit nicer and a bit more special. And my review of the regular 16 is coming soon, by the way. But I digress. The screen itself is great. To my understanding, the biggest change here is that the screen brightness can now also drop down to as low as 1 nit under certain circumstances. Certainly through my testing period at night in direct sunlight, I've had very few problems with this screen. It's nice. You, of course, get the dynamic island, all of that good stuff. The 16 Pro Max comes in your choice of 4 titanium colors. Specifically, there's titanium white, titanium black, natural titanium, which is what I've got, and desert titanium. Desert titanium amuses me as a name. I kind of think, is there like a titanium-clad rodent in the desert that Apple is hunting down to make these phones? No, by the way. But that digression aside, the name isn't just lip service around colour. These are actually titanium-clad phones, and the idea here is that they're meant to be more durable. No, I haven't done a whole bunch of drop tests. I've got a whole video on why I don't do drop tests and why I think most of the drop tests that you see on YouTube are pure garbage. But still, this should be a more durable phone. By the way, cases, they're great. You're otherwise talking a fairly nearly identically styled phone here, with the same kind of triple camera array that we saw on last year's models, USB-C at the base, the action button at the side. The new thing here is the camera control on the right-hand side of the phone. And the idea here is that it's a launcher for the camera, but it also gives you haptic feedback, so you can slide around to use it as a zoom or use half presses to engage specific modes, or even double half presses. And look, it functions, I suppose, but I've got to say, I'm not impressed. This feels like a solution to a problem that very, very few people had. The other problem I've had with the camera control is that physically, and this is a design thing, on the Pro Max, because it's got the larger body, it's kind of hard to put my finger in the right place to comfortably and accurately use the camera control the way Apple wants me to. It's actually easier, I find, to use the volume buttons for direct shot taking, or just use the on-screen UI if I want to adjust a variable. I'm not yet seeing something the camera control does better than what I could already do. And look, it's an open API, as I understand, so maybe someone will come up with some very clever thing that makes it a must-have feature, but right now, no, it feels gimmicky to me. What doesn't feel gimmicky are the cameras. And look, Apple's got a long history in providing really good cameras in its phones, and especially its Pro phones, because that's meant to be the point. And quick spoiler, yeah, they're still really very, very good. What you get is a primary 48 megapixel wide lens, a secondary 48 megapixel ultra wide lens, and then a tertiary 12 megapixel 5x telephoto lens. Now, as I mentioned before, you get that 5x telephoto whether you buy the Pro or Pro Max models, not what Apple did last year. And I do appreciate the fact that you don't have to buy the bigger phone to get the best telephoto experience. On the telephoto front, this does really rather well. You max out at 25 times, and look, that is less than some competing Android phones. There's quite a few that do 30 times and a few that do 100. But honestly, you do start to get diminishing returns, and what this does, even at 25 times, is pretty impressive. Naturally, regular photography, regular shots are all fine. You totally expect that at this point, and for the kind of money that Apple wants, especially for the 16 Pro Max. But it's also a really good low-light shooter. Now, I've got a complete separate video comparing its low-light prowess to that of the Pixel 9 Pro XL, so go watch that if you want a little bit more detail there. But even outside deliberately brutal testing conditions, yeah, I get nice low-light photos. This is a good camera. The 48 megapixel wide also enables some really nice macro shots. Now, quick tip here, do not use the camera control for macro, because you seriously nearly always will shutter. Something will go wrong if you do. There are much, much better ways to get macro shots without using the camera control. At least that's my experience of it. And it's not just a good stills camera either, with support, for example, for up to 120 frames per second 4K if you need that kind of slow-mo action in your life. And now, good video isn't just a question, of course, of moving pictures and lighting. It's also a question of audio. And here, the Proline phones get an exclusive feature called Audio Mix. And this lets you take most video shot with the iPhone 16 Pro Max and apply a bunch of different sounding effects to it. So you can get just the audio that's in the frame, or studio-style microphones, or even a cinematic kind of effect to your audio. So what does that sound like? Well, I've shot a couple of quick pieces here. Let's take a look. So how well does Audio Mix work? Well, here's a video of me just talking with the standard mics. Here's in-frame audio for your listening pleasure. And here's me using, for example, the cinematic settings. And then finally, the studio mic setting, because, hey, why not? So ultimately, does the iPhone 16 Pro Max live up to that Pro moniker in camera terms? Yes, it does. This is a really, really good camera phone. Now, I guess I have to qualify that by saying if you were coming from something like a 15 Pro Max, unless things like Audio Mix were super important to you, I think you're probably still very well served by that. But coming from older phone generations, yes, you will see the jump up in quality, and this is a really strong competitor against other Android phones if you were looking at switching. Which brings me on to the question of performance. So the iPhone 16 Pro Max is built around Apple's new A18 Pro processor, their biggest, baddest, fastest, meatiest processor out there. And for the longest time, if you looked at just direct CPU comparisons, Apple has ruled the roost, and spoiler, it still does. So if we just take an Apple versus Android flagship comparison here using Geekbench 6's CPU test, for example, then yeah, the 16 Pro Max uber alles, as it were. I'm not so sure, though, that that comparison is all that useful outside of flag waving. I have this strong suspicion that by now, in 2024, people are very much married into the camps that they're in. The iPhone users are there, the Android users are there. Yeah, you'll get a few people who might switch here or there generationally, but there's some pretty firm walls there. So what I think is probably more useful is knowing how it compares to prior iPhone generations. If you're coming from an iPhone that's 2, 3, 4 years old, what kind of jumps in performance are you seeing? So here's how that comparison goes at a CPU level. Apple doesn't completely rule the roost, however, because if we look at GPU performance using 3D Mark's Wildlife Extreme benchmark, then they're actually pipped at the post by an Android competitor. But the differences there are kind of marginal. I'll throw up again the Apple comparison here because, again, I think that's probably a little bit more relevant. But the reason why I say I think the differences there between the Samsung and the Apple probably aren't that much worth crowing about if you're an Android user is because I do think Apple has actually done a little bit more with its graphics power and with the kinds of things that use that graphics power, especially gaming. There's a whole host of AAA games that you can get only on an iPhone, and they run fairly well for running. Now, on these smaller screens, and even the iPhone 16 Pro Max is a small screen when you're talking about gaming, on these smaller screens, yes, there can be some control issues, and there's some interesting quirks in the way some of those games operate, but the way they run is really surprisingly good. I mean, kind of shockingly good for a smartphone, and there's just not the same kind of thing in the Android space as yet. So that one nearly becomes a tie. You, of course, get iOS, and iOS continues to evolve and change in a variety of interesting ways. And, of course, the flagship headline feature for the 16 Pro Max is Apple Intelligence. Apple's take on AI that's meant to make it easier for you to write documents and create Genmoji and do a few other interesting AI things, but not yet. So Apple Intelligence is still in beta as I'm recording this. Won't actually come to Australia till December this year. And look, I think the jury is still out on consumer-led AI and on whether or not they make a must-buy proposition. I get why Apple has to be in this game, but I'm not sure that it's a game that all that many consumers want to play. There's certainly going to be a certain proportion of consumers who absolutely will not want to play, and there will be a number for whom these features will be invaluable. I mean, as a professional writer, do I want Apple writing my stuff for me? No, I don't. I don't want anyone's AI doing that for me. I'll do that myself, thank you very much. But I can recognize that there is a market for this kind of thing. But as I can't test it, I can't really comment on it too much. On the networking side, you get Wi-Fi 7 and 5G, but annoyingly for the Australian model, it's still just a sub-6 GHz phone. Apple does have millimeter wave. It's in the States, of course it is. It's been in US-based iPhones for some years now, but we don't get that here, despite these being significantly expensive phones. This bugs me. It really does bug me. And yes, I know, the US model is eSIM only. We still get a SIM card tray, so if that's important to you, maybe that's enough of a trade-off. But I just think with these premium flagship phones, there's really no good excuse for why we are getting slightly worse phones outside of the US. It's penny pinching on Apple's part is actually what it is. It's them going, well, we can do it, so we will. And yeah, for a flagship, that leaves a bad taste in my mouth. And I've said that for Android phones too, because there's precious few Android phones that do millimeter wave here in Australia. But there are some. There are no iPhones yet. Maybe next year, Apple. On the battery front, the iPhone 16 Pro Max is a big beast of a phone. I think I've established that, no? But Apple's history with battery capacity has always been an interesting one because it's generally been one about efficiency rather than big battery numbers. They've put a lot more other technology inside their phones, but generally smaller batteries, and they've gotten away with it because the battery life has generally been better than their competitors in terms of having those smaller batteries. If their competitors had those smaller batteries, they would do a whole lot worse, which is why they've had larger batteries. But clearly, there's a little bit more space inside the iPhone 16 Pro Max because it does have a larger battery. Now, Apple never talks officially about battery capacities, but other third-party research suggests that the iPhone 16 Pro Max has a 4,685 mAh battery pack nestled inside it. Sealed, of course. You can't easily change that out. Apple, by the way, still hasn't launched self-repair here in Australia, but I digress. Battery life, of course, is more than just a question of who's got the biggest battery numbers. It's what you do with it that counts. And for this, my standard is my YouTube battery test. That's 1 hour, 1080p video, maximum brightness, moderate volume from a fully charged battery. Here I look for at least 90% battery remaining, and every percentage point above 90% can count for extra hours of usage. And here against its Android counterparts, the iPhone 16 Pro Max does pretty well. Not the best in class, but very, very solidly, very nicely, considering the amount of power it's got in play there. Put it up against a field of older iPhones, and here I do actually have a fair few more iPhones I can throw into the mix. My earlier benchmarks not so much because of the changeover to Geekbench 6 largely. Now bear in mind, these figures are from when these phones were new. If you've got one of those older iPhones now and you've had it for a few years, yes, you won't see that kind of battery level because batteries degrade over time. This is not the best performing iPhone I've ever seen in that test, but it's up there, it's solid, it's good, all of that is fine. When it comes time to charging, well, USB-C charging is supported as it has been now on iPhones for a while. Lightning is dead at Apple, basically. And you also get Qi and Qi 2 charging. It's MagSafe, but it is also Qi 2 certified, one of only a handful of phones, of course, that you can get that is Qi 2. Charging is not super fast. There are certainly Android phones that charge faster. But my own more anecdotal experience with it is, yeah, look, this will last you out the day, and an overnight charge will see you right for the next day, and that's all most people need most of the time. So should you buy the iPhone 16 Pro Max? Well, look, on the one hand, yeah, undeniably, this is Apple's best iPhone to date, and it absolutely should be. Look at the price of the thing. It absolutely had to be their best phone today. That can kind of be assumed unless something goes terribly, terribly wrong in Cupertino. If you want the biggest and fastest iPhone money can buy right now, this is the one to get. In the wider smartphone hierarchy, it's the most powerful, its cameras are right up there with the very best, and the wider iOS ecosystem does make a fair amount of use of that heavy processing power. This is a common complaint I have with flagships, that a lot of them have these big engines but you can't really do so much with them. The iPhone may be a little bit less so. However, and even allowing for the fact that Apple has actually dropped prices here in Australia year on year, this is a seriously expensive phone. Not that that's a new development for iPhones generally. The jury has to still be out on Apple Intelligence because we can't really test it in the wild and see how it does just yet. Even in beta, I would not view those results as conclusive. Apple can change up a whole bunch of stuff, and we don't know how much it might cost, and then there's the environmental. It's a whole different can of worms, which I'm not going to address in this video. The camera control, look, it's an interesting idea. I see what they're going for, but I just don't feel that it works all that well until somebody comes up with a genuinely compelling use case for it, and even then, the physical dimensions of it are going to make it harder to use than I'd really like to see. Is this a phone that's going to tempt Android users to switch? No, I think they're largely happy on the Android side of the fence, and that's fine too. Both OSs have their ups and downs. But for iPhone upgraders, I kind of feel, and I don't want to preempt my own iPhone 16 review too much, but I kind of feel like the iPhone 16 is probably the smarter buy for a lot of consumers this year, unless you really do need those pro camera features. That being said, this is a great phone, but it is super expensive, and that sting to your wallet, it's always going to hurt. Anyway, that's my take on the Apple iPhone 16 Pro Max. What do you think? Got any thoughts? Hit me up in the comments below, and as always, don't forget to hit like and subscribe.